The rain was relentless, falling in sheets that blurred the line between the highway and the distant horizon. The streets of the city were slick and treacherous, their gleaming surfaces reflecting the yellow glow of streetlights like a mirror. But for Charles, the night had been nothing out of the ordinary. A sanitation worker for the city, he'd spent years driving his truck through the streets in all kinds of weather, picking up trash and debris, his eyes scanning the sidewalks while his mind drifted between memories of his childhood and the present. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills. It kept his family fed, and that was enough. He'd been finishing his final run of the evening, his truck lumbering through the wet streets on the outskirts of the city, when the flash of headlights caught his eye in the distance. At first he thought nothing of it, there were always cars driving around at this hour. But something about the car's erratic movements as it swerved across lanes made him squint. It wasn't just any car. The driver seemed to be in trouble, struggling to keep control of the vehicle on the slick highway. His instincts kicked in. Charles had seen his share of accidents before, broken cars, overturned trucks, and the occasional wreck that made his stomach drop. But this felt different. The car's tires screamed against the wet asphalt as it swerved off the road, its engine sputtering as it veered dangerously close to the guardrail. He didn't hesitate. Pulling his truck to the side of the highway, he flicked on his emergency lights and threw open the door. The rain slapped him in the face as he dashed toward the scene, the sound of his boots slapping against the pavement drowned out by the pounding storm. The car had stopped, the driver's side door hanging open, and through the haze of rain he could just make out the silhouette of a woman slumped against the steering wheel, her body pressed forward from the force of the crash. It looked like she was unconscious, but the panic that gripped Charles's chest made him move faster, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He didn't know her. Didn't know anything about her except that she was in trouble, and she needed help. His job had trained him to keep his distance from the people he encountered on his route, to stay focused on the task at hand. But this was different. This wasn't just part of the job. This was something more. "Ma'am?" Charles called out as he reached the car, his voice lost in the torrential rain. He pulled the door open, praying that she was still alive. Her face was pale, the rain running down her cheeks as she groggily lifted her head. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused. She looked disoriented, her hand fumbling for the seatbelt release. The car was still idling, its engine humming weakly as the storm battered the windshield. Without thinking, Charles leaned in, his heart racing. He reached across her body and unbuckled the seatbelt, then carefully moved her into a sitting position. "Hey, can you hear me?" he asked, his voice low but firm. She groaned, a faint whimper escaping her lips. Slowly, her eyes focused on him, and Charles could see the panic in her gaze. Her breath was coming too fast, her chest heaving as she tried to gather herself. He could smell the alcohol on her breath, and for a second he wondered if it had played a role in the crash. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was getting her to safety. "Come on, I'm going to get you out of here," he said, his voice more reassuring than he felt. His hands were steady as he guided her out of the car, but he could feel the weight of her small frame pulling against him. She was barely conscious, barely able to stand, but she was alive. And that was enough. He led her to the safety of his truck, the rain stinging their faces as they hurried through the downpour. Charles barely noticed how soaked he was as he helped her into the passenger seat, quickly securing her inside before jumping into the driver's side himself. The woman's breathing had slowed, but her eyes remained closed as if the storm outside had drowned everything out, leaving her floating somewhere between consciousness and unconsciousness. Charles didn't waste time. He threw the truck into gear and peeled out onto the highway, his eyes scanning the road ahead. The emergency services would take too long to get here. In his heart he knew he couldn't wait. He needed to get her help, and fast. The streets were empty at this hour. The city was a quiet, rainy ghost town as Charles drove, his thoughts racing. He didn't know why he was doing this. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't trained to rescue people. He was just a sanitation worker, just a regular guy trying to make a living. But something had snapped inside him when he saw her, something that made him drop everything and risk his own safety to help a stranger. Maybe it was the years of seeing people take their lives for granted, or maybe it was just the raw, undeniable need to act when faced with a life-or-death situation. He didn't know. He just knew he had to do something. The hospital was about 20 minutes away. As the city lights flickered in the distance, Charles's mind began to race. What would happen to her? What if she didn't make it? What if his decision had been the wrong one? "Stay with me," Charles muttered under his breath, glancing over at her. She was still breathing, her chest rising and falling slowly, but she remained unconscious, her head tilted to one side. He couldn't risk it. He needed to keep her alive. He needed to make sure she didn't slip away. He drove faster now, his grip tightening on the steering wheel as the rain beat harder against the windshield. Her life was in his hands, and somehow that thought pushed him forward. It wasn't about whether he was capable or not, it was about the choice he had made to act when no one else was around. By the time they reached the hospital, Charles was drenched through and through, but his heart was racing in anticipation. He pulled into the emergency bay, jumping out of the truck before the engine had even fully cut off. A nurse rushed over, followed by a doctor and a few orderlies, and they quickly took the woman from his hands, moving her inside with urgency. Charles stood there for a moment, watching them take her away. The rain had stopped, and the city was eerily quiet again. His heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline still coursing through him. "She's going to be fine," a voice called from behind him. He turned to see the nurse standing there, offering a reassuring smile. "You did the right thing," she said, her voice warm. "She's going to pull through." Charles let out a deep breath, the weight of the night lifting from his shoulders. He nodded, his throat tight. "I didn't do much. I just couldn't leave her there." The nurse's smile softened. "Sometimes that's all it takes. You acted when no one else did. That's a lot more than most would." For a long moment, Charles stood there, watching the doors of the hospital swing closed behind the woman. He didn't know what would happen to her after this. He didn't know how much her life had changed or how much his own had either. All he knew was that tonight had been different. Tonight he had done something for someone else. Something that changed everything. He had saved a life. And in doing so had found his own in the process. Walking back to his truck, drenched and exhausted, Charles felt something he hadn't felt in years: pride. Maybe it wasn't about the job he had or the uniform he wore. Maybe it was just about the simple, quiet act of doing something selfless when it counted most. The rain began to fall again, soft and steady. And for the first time that night, Charles didn't mind it at all. Charles sat in his truck for a moment after the ambulance drove away, its lights fading into the night, the sound of sirens slowly disappearing. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle, the streets now quieter than they had been in hours. His hands were still shaking from the adrenaline, his mind spinning. He wasn't sure what had possessed him to rush out of his truck and help that woman. He didn't know her, didn't have a reason to get involved. But the image of her, unconscious and alone in that car, had haunted him. She hadn't been able to do anything to help herself. It was as if the universe had paused just long enough for him to step in. And so he had. He looked down at his hands, wet from the rain, a slight tremor still lingering in his fingertips. He wasn't a hero. He didn't know how to be a hero. He was just a sanitation worker. One who spent his days driving a truck through city streets picking up trash and debris. He wasn't trained to save lives. He wasn't trained to handle anything more than his shift, his route, and his job. But tonight, for some inexplicable reason, he'd stepped up when it mattered. Charles leaned back in the driver's seat, letting out a deep breath, his head tilting back against the rest. It felt strange, being caught in the middle of something so much bigger than his ordinary life. He'd never done something like that before. The thought that he could have walked away, left her there on the side of the road, gnawed at him. But he hadn't. Instead, he had made a choice to act. The sounds of the city outside the truck began to fade, and his thoughts wandered. His family, his wife and son, had been asleep when he left for his shift that night. He hadn't expected anything like this. He hadn't expected to be involved in something so significant, something that might change his life forever. But perhaps it wasn't just about the woman he saved. He couldn't shake the feeling that somehow he'd saved something in himself too. For years he'd felt like he was just going through the motions. Wake up, go to work, come home, repeat. It was routine, predictable, and exhausting. It wasn't that he hated his job. It was honest work, good pay. It provided for his family. But there was something inside him that yearned for more than just surviving. He'd buried that yearning deep down over the years, telling himself that it didn't matter, that it was enough. But tonight something had shifted. He had stepped out of the comfort of his routine and done something that mattered. He hadn't hesitated. He hadn't waited for someone else to step in. It was a simple, selfless act, and it had made all the difference. As the last of the storm clouds began to break apart, letting the moonlight seep through the sky, Charles reached for his phone. He hadn't called his wife yet. His hand still shook a little as he dialed the number. The line rang twice before she picked up. "Hello?" Her voice came through, groggy from sleep. "Hey baby," Charles said, his voice softer than usual. He smiled, his lips trembling a little. "It's me. I just wanted to let you know I'm okay." There was a pause on the other end. "You okay? You sound off. What's going on?" "I'm all right," he said, his voice steadying as he took a breath. I just wanted to say, tonight was different. Something happened. Different? She asked, now wide awake, the concern clear in her voice. What happened? Charles paused for a moment, his thoughts racing as he processed everything that had just transpired. I saved a woman tonight. She crashed her car on the highway. I don't know what it was, but I couldn't just leave her there. I helped her out of the car, got her to safety, and the ambulance came and took her. She'll be okay. I think. There was silence on the other end. Charles could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air. He wasn't sure how to explain it or even if he could. But his wife, his partner, finally spoke. You saved her? Her voice was soft but filled with disbelief. Charles? I don't know what to say. That's incredible. But, you don't normally do things like that. Why? I don't know, he admitted, looking out at the dark highway ahead of him. Something just felt right. I couldn't walk away. His wife's voice softened. You've got a big heart, Charles. I'm proud of you. The words warmed him, settling a weight on his chest he hadn't realized he was carrying. He wasn't just proud of himself in that moment. He was also confused. This act, this choice, it wasn't like him. And yet, it had felt like the most natural thing in the world. Thanks, he said, finally feeling the exhaustion of the night creeping back into his bones. I'll be home soon. I needed to tell you. Take your time, she said. We're just glad you're safe. The conversation ended with a quiet promise to see each other soon, and Charles hung up, sinking back into his seat. As the moonlight bathed the street in soft light, he finally allowed himself to process what had happened. In that moment he understood something he hadn't fully realized before. Life had more meaning than just getting by. It was about the moments when you acted selflessly, when you took a step forward and did something that mattered to someone else. He had never seen himself as a hero. But tonight he had been one. And that, in itself, had changed him. The city was starting to quiet down, the echoes of the rain fading as the storm moved on. Charles took a deep breath and shifted the truck into gear. He had a family to go home to, a life to continue. But now he would never look at his ordinary days the same way again. He wasn't just the sanitation worker who picked up trash. He wasn't just going through the motions. He had proven to himself that he could be more, that even in the quietest moments of life, there was always an opportunity to make a difference. The rain had stopped. The streets were clear. And for the first time in years, Charles felt like he was ready for whatever came next. The next few days passed in a blur for Charles. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, the woman he had pulled from the wrecked car. Her pale, trembling form in his arms, her labored breathing as he carried her to safety. It wasn't just that he had acted in a moment of crisis. It was the way he felt afterward, as if the world had opened up a little wider, as if he'd stepped out of the routine of his life and found something different, something important. But the feeling of uncertainty, of change, had lingered. It was like a quiet echo he couldn't shake, a reminder that his life, for better or worse, was not the same. He didn't talk much about it to his wife, Deja. He wasn't sure what to say, or how to explain the strange feeling that had come over him since the night of the accident. She knew he had helped a woman, but to him, it felt bigger than just that, like he had crossed some kind of invisible line. And then the phone call came. It was late one evening, the rain still coming down hard, tapping against the windows of their modest home. Charles had just finished his shift, exhausted as usual, and was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee. Deja was at the stove, humming softly to herself, when the phone rang, its shrill sound cutting through the calm. Charles glanced at it, then at Deja, who gave him a quick smile. You gonna get that? She asked. He nodded, wiping his hand on his jeans before reaching for the phone. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment. A local number. Probably a wrong number, he thought, but something told him to pick it up anyway. Hello? He said, his voice rough from the long day. Is this Charles Williams? A woman's voice, smooth but urgent, came through the line. Yeah, this is him. Who's this? My name is Linda Summers. I'm a reporter with the Sun-Times. I'm calling about the incident on Highway 45 last week. You helped a woman named Sarah Bennett. Do you remember that? Charles's stomach sank, a rush of heat flooding his face. He hadn't expected anyone to make a big deal about it. He hadn't even thought anyone would notice. He'd done what anyone would have done. He had just acted. Yeah, I remember, he replied cautiously. I helped her get out of the car. Is she okay? She's fine, Linda said quickly, a note of relief in her voice. She's recovering well and we're all very thankful for your help. But, Charles, I'm calling because Sarah wants to meet you. She said you were the one who saved her life, and she's asked me to help arrange something for you two to meet. Charles sat up straighter, his mind spinning. He didn't know what to say. He had no interest in being part of some grand public story. He wasn't a hero. He had simply done what anyone would have done. I don't know about that, he said, rubbing his forehead. I didn't do anything special. Linda seemed to understand, her tone softening. I understand, but Sarah wants to thank you properly. She's extremely grateful, and she insists that she wouldn't be here if it weren't for you. She's even asking about doing an article to highlight your story. Charles ran a hand through his wet hair. I really don't think that's necessary, he said, his words coming out more forcefully than he intended. I didn't do anything worth writing about. I just helped someone in need. There was a pause, then Linda spoke again, this time more gently. I get it. But just think about it. Sometimes people do incredible things without realizing it. You never know who's watching, Charles. And sometimes a story like this, your story, can inspire others. Maybe this could be a chance to show that even ordinary people can do extraordinary things. It's something worth sharing. Charles hesitated, his fingers tightening around the phone. He glanced at Deja, who was now watching him with a concerned look. He knew she was wondering what this call was about. Was it about his moment of selflessness? Or was it something more? He cleared his throat. Okay, he said, his voice low. I'll meet her. But just for a minute. No stories, no articles. I don't want any attention. Linda laughed softly. Of course, Charles. We'll keep it simple. Thank you so much. As soon as he hung up, Charles turned to Deja, his expression conflicted. She raised an eyebrow as she slid the pot off the stove, walking over to him. You good? She asked, concern evident in her voice. Charles let out a long breath. I don't know, baby. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. I mean, I didn't want any attention. I didn't do anything anyone else wouldn't have done. Deja stepped closer, resting her hand on his shoulder. I get it. But sometimes, Charles, people need to be reminded that there's still good in the world. That we don't just go through the motions. You did something good. You helped someone when they needed it most. Maybe it's not about you, but about showing others what it means to act with compassion. Charles looked down at his hands, the same hands that had lifted Sarah out of her car and carried her to safety. A part of him still felt like he didn't deserve any kind of recognition. He wasn't looking for a spotlight. But another part of him, the part he had buried for so long, began to wonder if there was more to this moment than just one good deed. Deja smiled softly. You never know, Charles. This might just be the start of something. You've always done what you had to do to provide for us. But you've also got a good heart. Maybe this is your time to see just how far that heart can take you. The next afternoon, Charles drove to the small cafe where he was supposed to meet Sarah. The rain had finally stopped, but the overcast sky hung heavy above, as if the world itself was waiting. He wasn't sure what to expect. Would she thank him profusely? Would she want to know everything about his life? When he arrived, he spotted her immediately, a woman in her 30s, her blonde hair tied back in a ponytail, dressed casually but with an air of quiet elegance. She stood up as soon as she saw him, a genuine smile spreading across her face. Charles, she said, her voice warm. Thank you for meeting me. He nodded, still a little unsure of himself. I didn't think I was doing anything that special. Sarah shook her head, her eyes sparkling. You saved my life. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here. I know it sounds dramatic, but it's true. I owe you everything. Charles shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I just did what anyone else would have done. But you didn't, Sarah replied softly. You didn't hesitate. You didn't think twice about it. That's what makes it special. Charles felt his chest tighten, the weight of her words sinking in. He hadn't seen it that way before. To him it was just another night. Just another job. But to her it was something much more. Something that had changed her life forever. For the first time, Charles realized that what he had done wasn't just about saving a life. It was about showing that one small act of kindness could ripple outward, affecting not just one person but many. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The next few weeks flew by, but the ripples of that single, selfless act didn't fade for Charles. Every time he thought about that night, a wave of emotions would rush over him. The fear, the uncertainty, but also the quiet realization that he'd done something bigger than he'd ever expected. His life felt different, altered in a way he couldn't quite put his finger on. He hadn't expected Sarah Bennett to be such a presence in his life after that night. At first, he had thought their meeting would be a one-time exchange. A brief thank you, a nod, and they'd both go their separate ways. But that was far from the case. Sarah insisted on keeping in touch, calling every few days to check in, making sure he was doing okay after everything. She even sent him a thank you card, one that was far more personal than he could have imagined. In that card, she wrote about how her life had been spiraling out of control before the accident. How she had been struggling, battling personal demons, and how she had felt lost. But then, she said, there was Charles, a stranger who had appeared at the moment when everything seemed hopeless, and in that moment she felt as if she had been saved from more than just the crash. She had been saved from herself. Those words echoed in his mind more than once, lingering like a soft hum. He had never thought of himself as anything extraordinary. Just a guy doing his job trying to get by. But the realization that his actions had affected someone so profoundly changed something in him. He wasn't just the man who picked up trash, who drove a truck around every day, who worked hard and went home. He was someone who had made a real difference in someone's life. And that thought, that realization, kept him up at night, questioning everything he had accepted as his role in the world. Maybe it wasn't enough just to get by. Maybe he was meant to do more than just survive. One afternoon, Sarah invited him to meet her again, but this time, it wasn't just for coffee. She wanted to offer him something in return. When he arrived at the cafe, she was waiting for him with a warm smile and an envelope in her hands. Charles, I know this won't change what happened that night, but I need you to understand how much your act of kindness meant to me, Sarah began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. I don't think you'll ever understand how much of an impact it had on my life. And I want to do something for you. Something that can make a difference in yours. Charles frowned, confused. Sarah, I told you you don't owe me anything. I just helped you because it was the right thing to do. I don't need anything back. But Sarah just shook her head, placing the envelope on the table. I know you don't. But I need you to accept this. It's not just for me, it's for you. For all the good you've done in this world, even when you didn't realize it. He hesitated for a moment before taking the envelope. Inside he found a check, an unexpected one for a large sum of money. It was a donation from a foundation Sarah had set up in her name, specifically for those who had selflessly helped save lives. I don't know what to say, Charles whispered, his breath catching. He had never seen this kind of money in his life, let alone been the recipient of it. I know it's a lot, Sarah continued, her voice now soft but unwavering. But this isn't just about the money. It's about the way you've affected the world. It's about showing people that there are still good people out there. People who don't hesitate to step up when it counts. Charles was at a loss for words. He didn't know what to say or how to respond. He had never seen himself as someone deserving of such an act. It was overwhelming, humbling. But in the quiet of that moment, something shifted inside him. It was as if Sarah's words and her gesture had opened a door to something new, a future he hadn't considered before. I don't know how to thank you, he said, his voice thick. I didn't do it for recognition. I didn't want to leave you there. Sarah smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. That's the thing, Charles. You don't need to be thanked. You already did more than most would have. And now it's time for you to take that next step. This is an opportunity, a way for you to do more with your life, to build something you've always wanted. Charles stared down at the check again, the weight of it pressing down on him. He had always been someone who worked hard, never expecting more than what he had. But now here he was, standing at a crossroads, with an opportunity that could change everything. The days following that meeting were a whirlwind. Charles thought about Sarah's words constantly, to build something you've always wanted. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that his life hadn't just been about working a job to get by. There was more he could do, more he could give. The notion of becoming more than just a sanitation worker began to grow in his mind. He began looking into business ideas, something that had always been a distant thought, a dream he thought would remain unfulfilled. But now, with Sarah's help, and with the newfound belief in himself that came from that single act of kindness, he realized there was a way forward. It was more than just about paying bills or getting by, it was about leaving a mark, doing something with meaning, something that went beyond his day-to-day existence. Weeks passed, and Charles found himself taking small steps toward a new direction. He enrolled in business classes at the local community college, using some of the money Sarah had given him to invest in a future he had never considered before. His family, once unaware of his internal struggles, now supported him wholeheartedly, proud of the change they saw in him. The impact Sarah had on his life was immeasurable. She had saved him, in a way, from the mundane existence he had resigned himself to. She had reminded him that his life was worth more than simply being a provider. He was a person with the ability to make a difference, and that realization gave him the courage to take risks, to reach for something greater. As Charles continued on this new path, he didn't forget the lesson Sarah had taught him that day. He wasn't just the sanitation worker who saved a woman on a highway. He was someone who had a chance to build something bigger, something that could affect his community and beyond. And he would do it with the same selflessness and heart that had driven him to help Sarah in the first place. As the years passed, Charles's life changed in ways he could never have imagined. His business flourished, but more than that, he found a sense of purpose, a sense of pride in what he had accomplished. The small act of saving a life had not only changed his own, but it had rippled out into the lives of those around him. And in that he found his true calling.